welcome to the Asian Journalists Forum. I'm your moderator, Chonglun Kuo. I'm the Deputy Managing Editor of the United Daily News. For the next 1.5 hours, we're going to discuss the journalism in Myanmar. After the coup of February the 1st in 2021, journalism in Myanmar have been facing a very harsh condition that no one from outside can really understand. But fortunately, we have a speaker who is very familiar with the situation here. Ms.艾敏丹, who had been very senior reporters affiliated with Reuters and other news organizations, currently is the feature editor of the Frontier Myanmar. Without further ado, let's welcome艾敏丹to our forum.
Thank you for that welcome.
And would you please begin your talk?
Okay, great. Let me just share my screen. So, hi everyone. Just want to start off by saying that it's an honor to have been invited to speak here today, and I'm looking forward to the discussion that will follow after this presentation. I am a freelance journalist and an editor for Frontier Myanmar. I have been living and working in Myanmar on and off essentially since 2014. I was born in Myanmar, but I have been educated abroad, and I think what I've been trying to do with my work in Myanmar is to really communicate outwards what's happening in Myanmar to the rest of the world. And so I think this is a really good opportunity, especially for communicating with people who may not be quite as aware of what's happening in the country. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity. I was told that the theme of this event would be journalism in crisis. And so this is something that really wasn't difficult to say yes to and to sort of think about what I wanted to say. And indeed, I think it might actually be a bit more of a challenge to stay under time. So I'm going to have to rely on our great moderator today to make sure that I'm not just sort of rambling. I think there are a few main topics that I want to cover in my presentation today, which are the sort of logistical challenges that that journalists are facing in just the day-to-day operations of reporting their stories, and sort of how those have really increased since the coup began in February of last year. I want to talk about the criminalization of journalism and journalists in Myanmar and how that is affecting our ability to work. I also want to talk about issues around shifting public perceptions of journalists, new ethical dilemmas that have emerged since the coup, or ethical issues that have became more challenging to address since the coup, as well as the widespread trauma that reporters are experiencing and dealing with. So on the first topic, in terms of logistical challenges, I want to talk about movement restrictions. So in Myanmar right now, it's incredibly difficult as well as dangerous to try to move around. And for a country that is quite large, I think Myanmar is about the same size as France, and has relatively poor infrastructure. So a lot of movement is facilitated by roads. The fact that there is so much conflict happening, as well as quite a lot of checkpoints all around the country, has meant that it's become incredibly difficult and dangerous for people to move around, especially for journalists. At checkpoints, it's quite common for people to have their devices searched or even confiscated, and for people to essentially be forced to pay bribes if they don't want to be arrested or if they want to try and keep the items that they have with them. And recently, I think near the end of March, a reporter was actually arrested because of pictures that they had found on his phone while he was being searched at a checkpoint. And I think there are also digital security aspects of this, and I'll touch upon that in a later point in the presentation. people are also dealing with just the inability to leave whatever area they're in. Sometimes that's, as small as a neighborhood in the city that they're in, or maybe something larger like a township. But essentially, it's really difficult to move within those areas as well as across areas. And reporters need to exercise extreme caution when they do so, in terms of both their physical and bodily safety, but also the safety of their devices, which would also could potentially compromise their contacts. In terms of the actual day-to-day reporting, is that it's incredibly dangerous and difficult to meet sources face-to-face. If you want to report on a battle that happened recently, if you're not already there, it means that trying to get there might be impossible, or it might mean that sources would have to take a relatively dangerous journey to try and come meet you if that's what they're trying to do. And it sort of creates a situation in which reporters end up in a bit of a bubble because it's hard to get across different lines on the map. And what you're seeing in your area, which oftentimes is already quite extreme, can seem like a in which it's easy to get a good sense of what's happening at a nationwide level across the country, because many reporters are essentially forced into what we might online call like an echo chamber, but in real life. There's also been issues of night raids where the regime forces have been searching for people in homes, including journalists. And one way they do that is by trying to make sure that everyone registers in the household that they live in, and that only the people who are registered can stay in that household. So we've seen cases where journalists, have had their houses raided because the regime wants to arrest them, but they're on the run, they're in hiding. That the people that they are actually trying to arrest, they will arrest family members, or they'll just harass people and then sort of take, essentially steal from the homes of the houses that they had raided. And it just creates a very fraught situation in which people can't even rest easy at night, right? Like even your sleep is compromised because of the danger of the danger of the situation in the entire country. And then, of course, many people are also living on the run. That includes people who are in the country, as well as people who are outside of the country. Many journalists are now living near the border areas, or have crossed the border, or often crossed back and forth of the border, and are living in this very precarious legal situation in which they are not by the authorities of the countries that they're in, like the neighboring countries that they're in, or because of the way in which the junta is enforcing its authority in the country. And all of this contributes to a situation of extremely high pressure on journalists to essentially stop doing their work for both their safety and that of their friends and family. And we hear reports all the time of people who've quit the profession. And even a friend of mine had quit. And the reasoning she gave when she talked to me about it was because she's an only child and she's concerned about what would happen to her parents if she died. I think another really large logistical issue is internet problems. The Myanmar regime is very fond of, at the very beginning of the coup, we saw nationwide blackouts, but in reality, Myanmar has been subject to the world's longest continuous internet blackout, or it holds that distinction of having the world's longest continuous internet blackout. And these certain regions, especially where there is more conflict, will have more comprehensive and have had longer periods of blackouts, but it can happen anytime and anywhere. And it creates a situation in which, in addition to not being able to travel, journalists are unable to contact their sources, or at least unable to contact their sources in a safe manner, because if people are forced to call on their phones, or they're forced to contact them through unencrypted services, an ethical dilemma. And I can talk a little bit more about that later as well. There's also quite a number of laws that are quite unclear in the country, or essentially laws that exist to make it easy to arrest people. It's unclear right now, actually, what the situation in Myanmar is in terms of websites which are banned. Some people can access them without VPN, some people can't. VPNs themselves are of a questionable status, where it was announced that they would be banned and people had been arrested for having been found with VPNs on their phone. But I don't think the law is actually passed. And so it's this very nebulous situation in which laws are a weapon rather than a tool in which to create. Devices and SIM cards have to be registered to you with their ID. And if it's not, it's technically illegal, which means every single phone and laptop in the country that isn't officially registered is owning it is technically a crime. And in fact, Aung San Suu Kyi, the leader of the former civilian government, who's currently imprisoned, she was found guilty of having unregistered walkie-talkies and was sentenced to 2 years in prison because of that. And because of all of this, there's been increasing cost of people needing to replace devices, get new SIM cards, as well as pay for internet. And all of this is contributing to a situation in which it's increasing. That leads me to financial difficulties and struggles. A lot of small outlets are really struggling to maintain their financing and maintain their operations, especially for outlets that write in languages that are not the main language of Myanmar, which is Burmese, or in English. And so we have a lot of ethnic media that is doing really vital and important work, but because their audience pool is smaller and because they get less attention from donors, and in some cases they don't have English, the English skills to even apply for money, they end up doing some of the most important work in the country with the least amount of resources to do so. And this kind of loop of the profession any of us really go into to make money, but the rising cost of living in Myanmar, as well as the depreciating currency, as well as just the average person's financial struggle, means that it's become much harder to stay in the profession if you're not lucky enough to essentially have some other form of income or be with a much more established outlet. And then there's also just extra costs that people need to deal with now. If you're on the run, you don't have enough anymore, or perhaps you are still paying for an apartment while you're on. And I think all of that compounds into the situation in which verifying stories and verifying facts and having an accountable news industry becomes much, much harder, because people are terrified to talk to journalists right now. They don't want to be named for obvious security reasons. And in many cases, people are scared to be seen to be talking to a stranger, because if someone takes that the wrong way, they might be accused of being an informer for either side, and that could put them in danger. And there's just very low trust right now across the country because of how many people are getting arrested, because of how much conflict there is. And on top of that, many journalists are not publishing with their names, or they're not identifying themselves necessarily, hiding, but you're still working. You can't exactly go around identifying yourself, and that creates an ethical problem. But also, if a number of outlets are underground outlets entirely run by anonymous journalists, where would you send a complaint to if someone got something wrong? Or how do you even really decide whether or not you can trust a group if you can't put names to the work? This is something that we deal with at Frontier as well, where we, as a newsroom, we've decided that journalists who are in the country will not be named for their safety. Journalists who are outside the country have the option of writing under their names, but even many of those journalists don't want to. Name is attached and they decide, well, and they can't find you to arrest you. They might go after your family. And so that becomes a really big problem. The numbers get very difficult to verify, especially if there's a bunch of anonymous journalists talking to a bunch of anonymous sources. How do we know that every outlet is essentially talking to the same 5 people, right, and getting the same story, not because it's true necessarily, but because it's the same people who are speaking over and over again. And there is propaganda coming from essentially all sides. The regime has control of state-run media, and so they have the widest reach in terms of their print newspaper, TV channels, radio, and they're trying to promote this image that everything is fine in the country. And then you have function more as propaganda for the resistance group, right, where it reports much more about successes. And it's a communication tool from the resistance rather than an independent news outlet. And I think the last difficulty with verification and accountability is that because many of us are reporting remotely, we are really reliant on essentially spokespeople for the groups that are involved in conflict. Because many of us, whether you're in the country or not in the country, if you can't get to the exact place of an incident that you're reporting on, we essentially have to trust, of course, creates its own set of, there's a lot of negatives with that, right? And it's hard to kind of trust any of these numbers on its face. So next, I want to talk about the criminalization of journalism. Journalists are being imprisoned, tortured, and killed. At least 3 journalists have been killed. The picture is only updated to 2021. In 2022, another journalist has been killed. Over 110 have been arrested, and 36 are currently in prison, according to Reporters Without Borders. And journalists are being arrested often on incitement charges or terrorism-related charges. Observers and those who have come out of prisons have told stories of being tortured, and a number of people who have been released from prisons now have long-term health problems because of the treatment that they faced. And many of them, when leaving prison, were also forced to sign pledges that say that they will not oppose the military, and they're monitored after they've been released. And so anyone who has been arrested and released, if they keep doing this work, take on the additional risk, even more risk than everyone else who's doing journalism, or they make the decision that they need to stop doing this work and do something else because it's too much risk to take on individually for their outlets or for their families. And this also has colleagues in newsrooms who have to take the time to try to help them, to locate them if we don't know where they're being kept. And it's just emotionally extremely taxing to know that your colleagues are going through something really horrific and you have very little power to stop what's happening or to really help them. I also want to say that these numbers are likely an undercount, in that these are people who sort of very publicly identify as journalists. And because many people are working in secret, it's likely that there's quite a number of people who have been arrested who are not part of this count. In addition to the targeting of individual journalists, outlets have also been banned. Basically every major independent news outlet, which means that essentially all of us are committing crimes in that we are continuing to publish. And now many of us are reporting from exile or are headquartered outside of the country. And relating this back to earlier points, this means that many of us, especially editors, are less and less connected to what is happening on the ground. And that has the danger of causing us to miss important stories, especially stories that are not centered entirely around the coup or a conflict that's happening. And also, for people in Myanmar, this means that getting news is very difficult and getting increasingly more difficult. Limited to options that function off the internet. And relating it back to the internet outages, that means it means that just huge parts of the countries doesn't have access to sort of independent, reliable news, and are basically their only other real choice is military affiliated or military controlled media. In addition to all of that, in addition to all of that, there's no real freedom of association in Myanmar. Journalists are getting accused of being terrorists, in some cases because they are speaking with groups that the regime has deemed to be includes ethnic armed organizations that are working in the country. It definitely includes all of the local armed groups that have risen up, the local People's Defense Forces that have risen up in villages and communities across the country to try to defend themselves from the attacks that they're facing from the regime. And that means that basically even just conducting an interview with someone means that you could be charged with the crime of terrorism. And then lastly, I want to talk about censorship that people are facing in the country. Myanmar has a very long history of censorship. Before August 2012, there was direct pre-publication censorship, and that was abolished. And flourishing of independent media in Myanmar, and private media was allowed to set up and have a great amount of editorial control. But since the coup, since most private outlets are no longer allowed to operate unless they support the regime, or basically they can't operate unless they support the regime, or basically don't report on the country's political situation in any way. And then there's also just very direct forms of censorship. Like the regime has basically ordered people to say that they're not allowed to use words like coup and junta and regime. So I want to talk a little bit more about public perceptions of the media. There is a big divide in Myanmar regime-controlled, independent, and pro-resistance. That's not to say that independent media doesn't want democracy to prevail in Myanmar. We do, but it's to say that this is a group of outlets and journalists who are working very hard to ensure that they are being neutral, not working on behalf of a specific revolutionary group or revolutionary groups. But this can cause some issues, because if you're not seen as being supportive enough of the resistance, people will essentially stop talking to you, or your outlet or yourself will be branded as potentially a traitor or someone who's sort of secretly working on behalf of the military. And a number of questions that journalists unfortunately get asked, especially if they ask a challenging question to leaders of the revolutionary movement, is, whose side are you really on? And while that's understandable in a context in which one side is very clearly, evil and killing with impunity and displacing entire populations, it's also really important for independent media to maintain neutrality and not sort of allow themselves to be co-opted, since that sort of fundamental value is a core part of helping maintain healthy democracies. And it's going to be something that's very important when the revolution. I think that's really related to this issue of media workers being seen as either heroes or villains. I think famously in the case of the Rohingya genocide and the news coverage around it, a lot of Myanmar people didn't trust independent news because they felt that it wasn't supporting the country, and it was sort of against the people of Myanmar. And now the stakes are even higher, and journalists are often and many journalists who are in hiding are essentially relying on the public and relying on the largesse of these armed groups that oftentimes they're trying to report, neutrally on, to keep them safe. And so that we do get this question of how critical reporters can actually be in these types of situations. Journalists find themselves in a position where, there are all these really big issues going on in the country where people's, lives are at stake. But because there is such chaos, there's also a great need for journalists to be educating the public, essentially, on what constitutes media ethics, to help them understand that independent journalists are not picking a side when they decide to be critical of one group or another. It's them trying to ensure that the public has access to important information that they need to make decisions about their lives. And then I think I've already talked a bit about the sort of limited daily reporting coming out of Myanmar is around, which village was attacked, how many houses were burned, how many people displaced, or how many battles happened and who died on the side. And while that's really important, I think something that is really challenging right now, because there isn't as much of a demand for it, and it, when you're seeing these atrocities, it doesn't seem as important. But even reporting on like harvest yields, and then what's happening at the border, in terms of border trade, can be really vital, right? Because it affects people's foods, it affects people's movement. And even if it's not sort of immediately things that are putting people in danger, something like the immunization of children or the lack thereof, people not have enough forewarning to start to kind of address it and prepare for it. And I think in terms of public perception of Myanmar journalists and of the Myanmar situation from a more international audience, there's a really big issue, I feel, with local journalists not being seen as able to objectively report on the situation in their country as sort of these international correspondents, people who are often from wealthier countries, often Western countries. And I think it's quite silly in that most of us report on our own communities, right? And like most of us report on situations to which we could potentially have emotional related by people of color, that we seem to get this divide between like journalists who can be trusted to report on situations and journalists who can't. And I think this is especially important for us to address, in that as more and more journalists flee Myanmar, or outlets just can't support as many journalists as they used to because they're not reporting on as wide a range of things as they used to. These sorts of jobs and these sorts of opportunities become increasingly important to support the livelihoods of those who are from Myanmar and staying in this field of work. Especially as global attention, focus of global attention, but that's eventually that will also fade. Something else will also replace it. So I think while there is still interest, or if anyone is wanting to cover Myanmar, it's really important to try to use local journalists. And just to give a number, there's over 150 journalists who are currently living near the Thailand-Myanmar border, and many of them don't have jobs. And especially for multimedia journalists, once they're out of the country, they really just their skills are not necessarily applicable, and there's just gonna be a lot of competition for the few jobs that are left. Dilemmas that many journalists are facing right now. I think the right of reply is a really big one, especially when it comes to the junta. It is not safe as a journalist to identify yourself as such and ask any member of the junta for an interview or a quote. But then you have to ask the question, do you report on something that is about this group, but you don't even contact them for information? Or do you just not report at all because it's, it's not seen as fair if you don't do that? But on the other hand, the junta has its own media apparatuses, and it has the ability to communicate if it wants to. And so you find yourself weighing and could literally cost you your life in certain cases. So it's very difficult to kind of think about these things as an individual reporter and as a newsroom. I think Frontier has largely taken the route of if regime-controlled media has made a comment on these things, right? Like they quoted a speech or they ran an editorial that addressed the issue that we are covering, we will take that and sort of use that as a form of reply, but we often won't contact them, especially if the journalist writing the story is one who is still in the country. I think also there are issues around state and there are issues around censorship of different levels at the state level on journalists. But I think at the sort of public level, there is also quite a lot of pressure on journalists who and outlets who want to stay relevant, who want to continue to have an audience. But it's an audience which is becoming less and less. I don't know if the action has actually changed, but it's less forgiving, I suppose, of coverage that they see as showing the revolution in any sort of negative light. And there's a lot of pressure to show positive news. And then there's also a lot of pressure on individuals, right, who may be making choices they would not otherwise be making in a less fraught position if they're even just protecting themselves. Like softening a word here or there, asking a slightly gentler question might be the difference between being harassed for months or, kind of nothing happening. And so those pressures are also something that, in a sort of invisible way, playing a role in the reporting coming out of Myanmar right now. I think there's also a great need to talk about issues around the pay and use of non-staff journalists. I'm counting stringers and fixers and all these people as journalists, but because they're doing a lot of the really important work on the ground with very little recognition of pay. And in some cases, even trying to pay someone can be difficult because of work that, publicly they're saying they're not doing. I think there's a great need to pay people more now, more than ever, because of the great risks they're taking on. And there's a lot of very brave people who, some of whom, for example, have come into Thailand and want to go back and get footage and then bring it back out so that it can be published. But at the same time, outlets need to really consider whether or not they are essentially encouraging people to take risks, especially since these people are not staff members who they would necessarily feel the need to take responsibility for in cases of injury, arrests, or deaths. And there's these opposite poles of wanting to do right by people, but yeah. And then I think in terms of this last point here, journalists are now finding themselves in a situation in which it's incredibly difficult to avoid conflicts of interest. So for example, a journalist may be working with a group to get food to their village. But a big story that could come out of that is food shortages in their village, right? But if they were involved in this thing that might have been necessary to their very survival, how can they really report on it without sort of having that conflict of interest? And all of us are essentially being forced into committing crimes because so many things that we do that are necessary to do journalism, from using VPN, we are now in a situation in which so many of us are essentially drawing lines, like very personal lines, about what is and isn't acceptable, and it creates a very fractured media space in which everyone is operating under very, maybe not two different ethical guidelines, but the guidelines are not necessarily clear because, it's not necessarily useful to be having public conversations about this right now, especially when there are much bigger issues that need addressing in terms of what's happening in Myanmar. And then lastly, I want to talk about trauma. Basically, every journalist on Myanmar in the recent couple of years have had personal experiences with trauma. I've personally gotten shot at. I have had to hide during raids. My mother is currently wanted and she's in hiding. I have a cousin in prison, and the weight of all of that is constant. And like personally, when I left the country last year, I spent most of the first 2 weeks kind of just crying. I really couldn't even work for a little bit. And, regardless of the personal experiences that individuals have had, people have also just seen some really awful things, right? People have seen people getting killed in front of them, seeing people just running away, very desperate. They're people who are just trying to report on these things and bearing witness and fulfilling that role. And I think there's also quite a lot of trauma in having to hide, having to live on the run, having to flee, having to try to recount your trauma, essentially, to go through the asylum process, to apply for funds that are there to help you. And then in many ways, I think it's often difficult for journalists to center themselves, right? Like we're not meant to be the story, but in these cases, when you need a safe place to be, you have to kind of take everything else out and recenter yourself. And I think that can be quite difficult. And when you're working, so, journalists are just exhausted, and unfortunately, there's no end in sight. Yeah, and I would have liked, I think, to end on a happy note, but I don't think that's something I can do until things in the country start to look better.
艾敏丹, are you basically finished your presentation?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And let me introduce our respondent, John Liu, who is the researcher.
Thank you. I just want to begin by saying A really covered comprehensively pretty much, all the aspects of the crisis facing, journalism in a country. Whether it's, journalists still struggling to survive within Myanmar, or like reporters trying to report on Myanmar from outside. So for my part, I like to draw my experience and observations to discuss, just to add on some points A made, I think. So I just had a brief chat with a journalist friend still working in a country. And I think echoing what A has just mentioned, livelihoods and survival has really become like the #1 issue facing journalists still reporting from the country. They don't go neighbors, partners, friends, and so on. And just as A has said, like from her own experience, sometimes they have to go on hiding from one place to another on a daily basis. And also like local journalists don't get the diplomatic protection as foreign journalists do. Like we saw, there was a Japanese reporter who was arrested early on last year, and then another actually 2 American journalists arrested and subsequently freed. Obviously, these are like happy news, but for local journalists, things are not as easy or as things are just grim, essentially. That's what I want to say. So there's also, because of power outages, internet blackouts, and subsequently like the whole newsroom and the media is rattled because they're just concerned of the reporter's safety. So it just makes this whole situation, like what managing reporters on the ground or like working with local or citizen journalists on the ground, really hard. So I think that's, the safety, the livelihood issue is right now, the constant fear for reporters and media right now. But besides safety, there's also the issue of, going on with their daily lives. Sometimes it is just impossible for people in Myanmar, you just cannot expect reporters, to cover news like before, like the pre-coup way, like, going on to the street, asking questions, or like having interviews, having in-person meetups and so on. So like a lot of times A has actually mentioned this a bit, like when traveling even within Yangon or Mandalay, like these big cities, like because of the movement restrictions, the blockades military has set up, a lot of times when reporters traveling on the street, they cannot really actually have their phones with them because there could be anything, whether it's a photo or just a text that could incriminate them. And if the military found a trace of that kind of, this may sound like really absurd to a lot of people, but this is already sort of like a small issue facing journalists working in Myanmar right now. Besides this, there's obviously, the rising food prices, the rising prices of gasoline, oil prices. Essentially, it just make it really hard for reporters to survive. On top of that, there's the internet issue Aid has touched upon. And because in this era, like internet is essentially what, reporters rely on to get information, or like any source essentially, rely on internet to send out this critical information. There's like tons of messaging being sent out, but because, the increasing use of internet blocks, blackouts, the surveillance and everything, it just become harder and harder to get these information. And also, like, besides getting information, how do you verify them is another question, another issue essentially. And I think on top of that, when we talk about like the internet blackouts, we also saw like over this past year, some of the private telecom providers succumbing to the junta's pressure, whether they're trying to, sell off their assets in Myanmar, or just, don't dare to go against what protect their freedom of speech as they had in the past 10 years, for example. Another thing I think A has rightfully pointed out is the trauma issue, which I think just an issue that we rarely touch upon, especially within Myanmar context, because a lot of times with all the killings, like the physical hardship that's been going on, it's people just don't discuss as much, like this kind of emotional trauma or the mental toll the coup and all these atrocity has taken on them. So I think this is a really important aspect of, but also like facing reporters that has fled the country as well, because a lot of times their family members, their friends, they'll reside within the country, and they also have to constantly be alert or like just worry about their friends and family within the country. Another thing is, even if they fled the country, I have Myanmar friends, not necessarily journalists, but they had to confront themselves with the guilt, the survivor guilt in a sense, because they managed to get out from the country, but they also had to, witness everything that's going on, like, people risking their lives, people being killed, friends and family dying. Last year there was COVID outbreak, definitely has taken an emotional, mental toll on them. So this is really an important aspect I want to highlight, that is the trauma issues. As for journalists reporting from overseas, I think verification and fact-checking have become incredibly difficult. Speaking from my own experience, I think last year when I was still covering Myanmar, while I was in Taiwan actually, a lot of times it is just inherently hard to, get to the source to confirm this information, to double check like the video, the photos that got sent out, whether it was taken by this person, whether it's witnessed by this person or not. But are inside the country, it's become an issue. Like verification and fact checking, it just become really hard. I think last year when the coup just broke out, in the first few months, especially, we saw a lot of news, a lot of actually tweets essentially being sent out by journalists saying like, the coup is, instigated or perhaps pushed by China, or like, news related to that because they're citing information, they saw, but it's not exactly verified or fact checked. I remember there was this video being sent on, was actually viral on Twitter, and people were saying, oh, they heard recently, even some journalists jump at it and saying like, oh, this is the evidence that China is already sending troops into the country. What I want to try to say is that it's not that we want to defend China or like defend the military in any kind of way, but it's just that fact checking is what we as a journalists or journalists in general have to stick to. Another thing I think A has pointed out is the public perception of media. I think it is, I think as things go more and more polarized, especially between, the NUG supporters and the military, as our job is to ask the tough questions. I think last year, I remember there was a time when when there was a COVID outbreak last year, and because there was pretty much no vaccination. Oh, I should put it this way, because like the vaccines are administered by, public hospital mostly. A lot of people are boycotting, and, medical officers like doctors and nurses, because they were on strike, they're joining the civil disobedience movement, the campaign, the protest campaign. They don't go to work anymore. And then because of that, a lot also like because of that, because what I was trying to say is people don't go to public hospital. One of the doctor for interview, I asked like, do you feel like perhaps a bit responsible for people not getting vaccinated because people don't go to public hospitals because you're boycotting them again? And I think this is a question that I, as a journalist, I want to ask, but like immediately, like the doctor got very sort of like offended in a way that's saying, don't you dare question our intention. So there's this kind of situation, or like A has mentioned, people were like attacking journalists saying, you shouldn't question NUG. You shouldn't question what they're doing. But, as journalists, or the NUG, what they're doing, are they doing what they should be doing, or all these questions that should be already tossed out? And it's something that we journalists has to stick to, I think. I think the last aspect of what I want to talk about is just how to support Myanmar media. Like a lot of Tani's friends or, friends from outside Myanmar, they've been constantly asking, ways to support, Myanmar media. And I think for now, the best way is to continue to, subscribe to independent media like Frontier Myanmar, like Myanmar Now, and support the survival of these media, trying to get the news out, and whether it's financial support or any kind of support, I think it will be much appreciated. So I think that's it, sort of my comments on what A has mostly discussed, and I think we can open the floor back to you.
Muted. Thank you for that question. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a complicated one in that personally, I don't believe in, I don't really believe that any of us can achieve true objectivity. I think it's a really good thing to strive for, but all of us come with foundations of knowledge that we bring to our individual reports, right? So I think in some ways, whether you're using a local journalist versus an international correspondent, you're making a series of trade-offs. I think oftentimes what works really well is, especially for international outlets, is to have a mix of both, right? Like you want someone who, in many cases, because they're less familiar with the situation, might ask questions that a local journalist might not ask because they're just assumed, right? Like everybody knows this, so why would I write about it? But on the other hand, the local journalist can also provide just like a deep lived knowledge of what is happening on the ground, but also just, there's a group in Myanmar called the KNU/KNLA Peace Conference, and that is different entirely from the KNU/KNLA. But if you're an international reporter, you might have seen these two names that look nearly identical and assume they're the same group. And you might make that mistake if, you know, even though they have very different political objectives. Yeah, so I think you're making trade-offs at all times. I do think that local journalists are not inherently more biased, but they are dealing with a very different set of circumstances that may be affecting their decision-making. And that if the international correspondent were dealing with similar and sort of maybe restrictions and the decision-making process might be similar. So I think there's an importance at the editorial level to try and screen some of these things out, but not inherently dismiss local journalists.
Right. Let me raise one of the issues that make conflict with international journalism and local journalism is the Rohingya genocide. While the local journalism seemed to be sympathy with the majority opinion, that including the Aung San Suu Kyi government, that they don't think there's anything wrong with it, while the international reporting is focusing on what kind of genocide and what kind of misery condition that Rohingya minority is. What
really had to contend with, right? Like we were local journalists in Myanmar who were, one, using the word Rohingya, and two, calling it a genocide. And we were getting just so much abuse, not just from the public who didn't want this kind of reporting, but also in some cases from our colleagues who were very much, you know, of the belief that, you know, what they had learned in their history books written by the military dictatorship was correct. And the information coming out of a military that until 2012 was doing pre-publication censorship, right? Like assuming that they weren't lying to them. I mean, I think it's a great stain on the journalistic tradition in Myanmar, but I also think a lot of progress happened since after the coup. People have really started to come to terms with the ways in which they really bought into these lies and have begun to more critically engage with these issues. And I also think that's to say that, you know, like I'm not advocating you work with a journalist just because they're local, right? Like there's always going to be a wide range of quality and ethicalness and professionalism in any profession. So yeah, I guess what I want to say is we shouldn't be dismissing people because they're local, but because someone is local doesn't also necessarily mean they're more reliable.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, there are news outlets outlets that are currently functioning in the country. The regime spokesperson, Zalmintun, routinely holds press conferences, and there's always journalists there. Most of these outlets are new. They popped up after the coup, and many of them are owned by people who have military affiliations or are veterans themselves. And so I think, when we talk about news outlets, it's a question of the quality that is allowed. The Irrawaddy and Ms. for example, started off as exile media. And even Frontier, many of us, or many of the older people involved started off reporting from outside the country. So I think there is maybe historical trauma and then caution there that would prevent them from going back in the first place, at least for quite a while. Especially, as John said, for reporters who don't have that level of protection that might come from foreign nationality.
There's a question regarding, we have just said, how do you evaluate the current news coverage of Myanmar from the proper job there? How trustworthy are their reporting?
I think it really depends on the outlet. So I would say for outlets like the New York Times, Reuters, AFP, like big international outlets that have had a presence in Myanmar and are largely operating with the team that they had when the coup started. I say they have done a pretty good job. Obviously, they cater to a very different audience, so the things that they choose to cover, I think, are often quite different from what local media chooses to cover. But then I think you would compare them mostly with other international outlets that covered Myanmar because it was a big international event, but not necessarily because it was a place that they generally cover. And I think there the coverage is often much weaker, and the editors, I mean, it's also an issue of the journalists, but like you have a layer of editors who don't have very much experience with Myanmar, and so mistakes pass through much more easily, or just, especially when you're working in multiple languages, right? Like sometimes it's even just a translation error and no one catches it because someone doesn't have that knowledge. But yeah, I would say the coverage has been, the international coverage, I think, has been, sometimes it's disappointing in that it often focuses on Aung San Suu Kyi and what's happening with her. I think it's because she has that name recognition, and it's it's a nice hook for an international audience that is not as familiar with the country. But she was arrested on the first day. She's essentially not been seen since, and so many other things have happened. And I do think sometimes these outlets are compromising on more interesting and important details in favor of ensuring that that name recognition is there.
There have been several show trials on Aung San Suu Kyi already. How do the media have been reporting on his trial? I mean, if it's lean on all the accusations, sometimes it will turn into a propaganda by the junta. But how do you verify all those accusations? And how do you think the reporting on the trial of Aung San Suu Kyi have been?
So there's been extremely little reporting on her trial, actually, amongst local media. Most of the reporting essentially just says the trial happened this day, this person spoke, and this decision was made by the judge. It's in part because media is not allowed into the trial. So that just creates that barrier inherently. And also a gag order has been ordered by the junta, not the judge, the junta, onto Aung San Suu Kyi's lawyers. And so any information that's coming out is essentially from anonymous sources that are quite difficult to verify. The lawyers aren't talking, the journalists can't get in. We do know about the individual charges. In some cases, we know the person who is making the accusation, or the witness who would be making this accusation. In most cases, they're also in prison, right? So that calls into question how willing their testimony actually is. And And then there's also just some charges that are kind of laughable on their face, right? Like the walkie-talkie charge. You don't throw someone in prison for having an unregistered walkie-talkie. It's just very silly. And then there are some charges that, you know, may have some veracity. For example, one of the charges is that her personal foundation was able to lease land from the government for less than the market value. You know, it could be true, and in a different time, it might be worth investigating. But when it's so clear that they are just throwing every charge they can at her to keep her in prison, and there are, you know, much bigger issues happening around the country, I agree with the general local consensus that, you know, this one case is not necessarily worth investing the resources in looking into. So in terms of how people can help support, as John said, it's very helpful for people to subscribe to the various outlets. Phandeeyar runs on a membership program. That's how we're funded. I know other outlets like Myanmar Now run on a donation basis. I think they run ads as well. So I think like any outlet that gives you an avenue to give the money is a great way to help support. There's also been initiatives and media support groups that are helping. So I know Reporters Without Borders, the Committee to Protect Journalists, like they have emergency funds that they provide, including to Myanmar journalists. So if you have a connection with a journalist, it might be helpful for you to help them fill out a form, right? Like some of these journalists like don't write in English and all of these forms are in English. Even something as simple as that can be helpful, or just directly donate to those organizations and tell them, I want you to spend this money on Myanmar journalists could be helpful. And then there are also crowdfunding initiatives. I know in the early days of the coup, there was a person who was running donations for VPN services. So she just bought a number of VPN subscriptions and was just handing out access codes to journalists. And you know, that's a very cheap way even to provide very direct security support to journalists. I think in terms of Taiwan specifically, I'm not really sure. I think John might be a better person to answer that question, in that I'm not quite sure exactly what the potential avenues are. I do know that there is a decently large Burmese community in Taiwan, and they are holding fundraisers. So if you hear of a fundraiser, you could go. The money might not directly go to journalists, but it will definitely go to someone in Myanmar who's in need.
And another question is people asking, you haven't answered is, do you see any near the end of this military government? We see that now the government seems to be consolidate all its power, but would it collapse someday, and in what form? I know that military junta had been ruling Myanmar before, but during the past 10 years, it had transformed itself. Would the same kind of things happen in Myanmar?
I mean, it's difficult to say. If I knew what their was, I think I wouldn't be doing journalism. I would be quite optimistic that the junta will eventually fall. I think all dictatorships eventually fall. Ideally, this happens sooner rather than later. You know, you said earlier that they're consolidating their power, and I think we are definitely seeing signs that they are running out of people. I know there's been a lot of reporting, and especially opinion pieces talking about like defections and sort of how close they are to collapse. But in the last month or so, we've seen a number of female combatants fighting on alongside as soldiers for the junta. And you know, this is a deeply misogynistic institution. I think for them to have had any woman on the field really is a really good sign that they don't have enough soldiers, or as many like male soldiers that they would ideally like to have, and they are getting a bit desperate to sort of control the physical space. And I think also, despite the sort of what seems like a lack of progress, because we're just seeing sort of very protracted violence and conflict, I think the fact that they haven't won yet is a really good sign, right? Like, this is an institution that has it's a multi-billion-dollar budget, and the NUG said their budget was 42 million last year.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that, like, you look at these two pots of money and the 42 million hasn't lost, right? And indeed is doing quite a lot of damage in the field of battle. And in some other cases, like establishing schools, alternative vaccine programs, and sort of beginning to provide normal government services in some of the areas it controls. I think it shows that things aren't as uneven as they might seem if you're kind of looking at the broad numbers and looking at kind of just the sheer scale of repression that they engage in.